It's Anna. Looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Always nice to see you. Anna, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. We had a good morning of homeschooling today, so now I'm looking forward to learning myself.
Nice. So glad to hear it. Well, that's a perfect segue too, Kristina. If you're ready, I think we're going to get started. I know we're going to have a few more people joining us on the call, but I want to kind of get my Zoom overview done with and turn it over to the person you really came here to see. So welcome everyone. So nice to see all 72 of you here today for another Art at Noon. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Abby King, the Assistant Director of Adult Programming here at PAFA, and I facilitate these weekly Zoom calls. I'm really grateful today to have such a nice crowd from my colleague here with us today, and especially today's topic.
Well,
really.
Tell you what Roberta said.
Hold on one second. So I am going to ask, this is a good segue. I am going to go ahead and
thinking that it's not advisable to go in September.
One second. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to go over just some quick Zoom tutorial info. Like the first thing is please don't unmute yourself or you'll get interrupted mid-thought just like that. But I'll talk about that in just a second. I wanted to mention, or I wanted to start the way I always start is with a big thank you to our members for coming out today and supporting us today and every day, especially for a talk when we're thinking about the importance of supporting the arts and looking back at this historical moment. I think we of course have to thank the people that are supporting PAFA. So if you haven't joined already, please consider, and thank you again to our members for being here with us. So I know many of you have been on these calls and know that I'm just going to spend the next 2 or 3 minutes talking about how we facilitate these. I know we're almost all Zoom experts, but just in case. So the first thing is that you basically have 2 ways you can visually experience Zoom today. You can do it on speaker view. So if I'm like the big head at the bottom of your screen, you're in speaker view. That is what I'm going to recommend that you keep this program in, at least for the beginning portion, or not the beginning, for most of the time, since Kristina is going to be talking for the next 40 or so minutes. She's going to be sharing her screen and showing you some amazing images. So keep it on the big screen if you can. Your other option is going to be on the upper right-hand corner where it says gallery view. You can switch and see everybody. So I'm doing that now, and I can see many of you, all 89 folks on this call. When we open it up to question and answer, it might be fun to switch it this way so you can see people as they ask questions. I will say I've already gone ahead and muted everybody. I am going to ask you to stay on mute for the call. So the same way I used to ask you to silence your cell phones in an auditorium, I'm going to ask you to silence your Zoom screen. That's because even if you think you're being quiet, all it takes is a cat walking in, meowing, and the screen is no longer on Kristina, it's on your cat, which is adorable, but for the sake of this event, I would ask that you keep it on our speaker today. The controls are at the bottom of your screen. There's a microphone button where you can unmute and mute yourself. Again, if you accidentally do that, just feel free to mute. Next to that is where it says video button or stop video. If you can't see yourself on the screen and you'd like to, if you click on that again, the red line will go away and we'll be able to see your face. We love seeing our audience, but feel free to experience this whatever feels the most comfortable. I also want to mention that because we are recording today's event, we get asked that all the time is when are we posting these videos, and they always go on our YouTube channel. So we want to be able to share these educationally for people that can't be here today for whatever reason. So if you're uncomfortable being on camera, feel free to just mute your camera button and you'll no longer be on the recording. I'll also mention that the recording is mostly just whoever is actively speaking. So unless you're asking a question, you won't predominantly be on the screen. With that, so we want to hear from you. We do. I know I've just muted all of you, so that might not seem as intuitive, but there's a couple ways that we want to hear from you today. So one of whom is our chat. So we've already got some questions already in the chat from people coming in early. Feel free throughout the entire program to drop in links, questions, thoughts. We will have time at the end to address some of these in the Q&A. And also for that, we would love if you want to verbally ask a question. Since there's so many of us on the call, we can't just all kind of call out and unmute ourselves. I'm going to ask you to virtually raise your hand. So the way you do that is at the bottom of the screen where it says participants. So a couple down from that video button. You see that there's on your right-hand side, if you're on a computer, it pops up and it says virtually raise hand. So when you do that, me and Kristina will be able to see you. That way then we can call on you and organize it that way. If you have trouble with this, feel free to kind of go like this, but there are 105 people here with us today. So if you don't mind, please drop it in the chat or virtually raise your hand. I'll also want to mention that you're going to want to pin Kristina. So I would recommend doing that so you don't lose her in this big call. So Kristina, can you wave and say hi for a second?
Hi, everyone.
So if you find Kristina's square, if she's at the bottom of your screen, or if you go into the kind of Brady Bunch view, there's 3 little dots on the square next to her face or in her face. And if you want to click it, there's a drop-down menu that says pin video. So that means that no matter who's talking, you're going to see Kristina, and that's going to be helpful since she's going to be predominantly speaking today. I'm sure I'm leaving something out because I almost always do, but I want to drop one more quick thing in the chat. But it's now my pleasure to hand it over to our speaker and my wonderful colleague, art historian and team programs coordinator, Kristina Murray. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for that intro, Abby. And thank you everyone for joining today. I'm really excited that so many people have been able to log on and check this out. I'm gonna go ahead and get my screen shared for you all and get everything situated on my end. There we go. Okay, so my talk today is entitled Art in the New Deal. So what we're going to be doing is investigating the significance of Depression-era government-funded art programs created by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So I want to talk you through a little bit of the structure. So I'm going to start off with an introduction to the New Deal, explain what that is, and explain the various art programs that fall underneath its umbrella. We'll take a little bit more of an in-depth look at the Federal Art Project, which is the largest of the art programs that fell underneath the New Deal programming. We'll have a discussion of the philosophy behind the Federal Art Project, because it's really, really fascinating to look into why it was structured the way that it was and why it was carried out the way that it was. And then we'll take a glimpse into some of the artists who benefited from that program, and we'll look specifically at some of the artists that are featured in PAFA's collection. And then we're going to sort of end with a really fascinating case study of the photographer Berenice Abbott, who had a years-long autonomous program that was funded by the FAP, and she's a really, really fascinating example of exactly how artists could take their independence and kind of run with a really interesting project and have it completely funded by the government. So that's what it'll look like. We'll end with some time for discussion and questions. All right. So here we go. Okay, so to start, the New Deal was a series of programs, public work projects, financial reforms, and regulations that were enacted by FDR from 1933 to 1939. So this was something that he really campaigned on as he was running for president. He became president in 1933, so this was 4 years into the Great Depression. The stock market had crashed in 1929. The country had been suffering, and he really campaigned on this idea of what can we do to bring back, did I do that? What can we do to bring back the economy and support the arts? So the program was focused on what we now refer to as the 3 R's. So he was looking into relief efforts. So relief for the unemployed and the poor. The second R was recovery. So we were really trying to recover the economy back to normal levels. And then the third goal of the New Deal was really looking into reform. So he wanted to reform the financial system to prevent any repeat depressions. The New Deal included a lot of new constraints and safeguards on the banking industry, and it had a lot of efforts to reinflate the economy after prices had sharply fallen. And the New Deal had a lot of different elements to it. A lot of those were laws passed through Congress, but FDR also issued a few presidential executive orders to get this stuff up and running. So there are kind of two parts to the New Deal. The first New Deal was enacted in 1933 and ran through 1934. This was really addressing the bank crisis specifically. But the second New Deal, which was enacted in 1935, was more sweeping and had broader reforms. So this is where we saw what's called the Works Progress Administration. This was an institution ran by Harry Hopkins, and the goal of this was to employ millions of job seekers, mostly unskilled men, to carry out public works projects, which included constructions of buildings, roads. A lot of the infrastructure that you'll still see today throughout our country was constructed during the 1930s as part of the Works Progress Administration. I think my parents are probably on here, but my mom and her friend were taking a walk recently, and they came across some signs that showed some things that were built in my small hometown of Greenville, Ohio, that had a WPA sign on it. So once you kind of start looking around in your neighborhood or as you're taking walks, you'll tend to notice some things that might have been built during this time, because we really do still have a lot of infrastructure that's still in existence today that was constructed then. The Works Progress Administration was really focused on creating opportunities to return the unemployed to the workforce, and it was definitely successful in doing that. So I'm going to break down some of the Depression era art programs. There's quite a few that existed during our time throughout the 1930s, but we're really going to focus in on the Federal Art Project specifically, but I wanted to introduce you to some of these other ones, okay? So the very first Depression era art program that was enacted was the Public Works of Art Project, or the PWAP. This was in existence from about 1933 to 1934, a little bit less than a year. And this was a program to employ artists to give work to artists who could kind of really need it. So a lot of what these artists were doing they were embellishing public buildings. They were told that they had to stick within the parameters of creating something that related to the American scene. And so what you see is a lot of murals, a lot of works that are a bit propaganda in nature. And these are found throughout the country. So these artists were paid pretty well. All of these programs, the government paid the artists fairly well. And this particular art program, the Public Works of Art Project, there were over 3,700 artists who were able to participate through this. The next project I wanted to break down is the Treasury Relief of Art Project. This one ran for about 4 years, and this was the Treasury Department proposing to get money from the WPA to hire artists to embellish their buildings. So this was really focused on Treasury buildings and not other buildings. This project, in the end, there were 85 murals, 39 sculptures, and over 10,000 easel paintings that were completed. The next project I'll talk about is the Farm Security Administration. So this wasn't an art project per se, but it kind of became a de facto art project over time, and it's something that's very much remembered today for its significance. So the Farm Security Administration was a New Deal agency that was created in 1937, and it was really created to combat rural poverty throughout the United States. So this institution has become really famous for its small but highly influential photography program that portrayed the challenges of rural photography. You can see on the screen here, one of the images that has kind of stood the test of time from this program is this image created by Dorothea Lange of Migrant Mother, which again has just become iconic to American culture, and specifically what the Great Depression represents to us as Americans. Tons of photographs were taken during this time. Over 175,000 black and white film negatives exist from the FSA's work in photographing the rural poverty that was seen throughout the country. 11 photographers would work on this project. Dorothea Lange is, of course, the one that's kind of really become known to a lot of us, but other photographers like Walker Evans participated in this as well. And as I mentioned, this is really a program that shaped the public's image of the Depression in rural areas in the United States. The final art program that I want to talk about from the Depression era was Federal Project Number 1, which ran from 1935 to 1943. And it had several different branches, which I'll break down for you. So the federal, oh, excuse me, get this over here. Okay, so Federal Project Number 1 was a WPA project that employed musicians, artists, writers, actors, directors, and had programs in the arts, drama, media, and literacy. And there were kind of 5 different subsections of this. So the first one is the Federal Writers Project. This is something that operated in every state. And one of the things that these writers did was they created famous guidebooks that you can still find today. They cataloged local archives and folklore, and writers such as Zora Neale Hurston were employed by this institution. The Historical Records Survey is another really important aspect of Federal Project Number 1. One of the things that the Historical Records Survey did was many former slaves from the South were interviewed, and their conversations and thoughts were documented and put into an archive. So we have a living document that exists from that time period. The Federal Theater Project was another one that was really influential and important. Thousands of reduced price and free stage productions were put on throughout the country as a result of this project. Same thing with the Music Project. There were tons of music projects and performances put on throughout the United States. It's estimated that more than 225,000 performances were given between the Theater Project and the Music Project at this time, which is really significant. And then we're going to spend a lot of our time today talking specifically about the Federal Art Project. And I really loved this photograph that I found that I've included on the slide here that shows a Michigan artist sketching WPA construction workers. You can kind of see some of the public works employees working with some of the Federal Art Project employees to kind of showcase, again, what life was like during the Great Depression during this time. Okay. So the Federal Art Project was the largest of the New Deal art programs, and it was really meant to fund the visual arts throughout the country. So it was created not as a cultural activity, but as a relief measure. So it was meant to employ artists and artisans to create murals, easel paintings, sculptures, graphic arts, posters, photography, arts and crafts, all kinds of things. The WPA Federal Art Project actually also established more than 100 community art centers throughout the country. They researched and documented American design. They commissioned a significant body of public art, oftentimes without restrictions to content or subject matter. So artists were really given a lot of free range with their choices. And this Federal Art Project sustained more than 10,000 artists and craft workers during the Great Depression. So it had a very broad scope, very significant outreach, supported a lot of artists and communities, which is just wonderful. And one of the reasons why I've always found the Federal Art Project so fascinating is the man who created it and his philosophy was very innovative and new. So FDR hired Holger Cahill to be the director of the Federal Art Project. He is an Icelandic American man who was living in New York City at the beginning of the Great Depression and working, he worked at the Newark Museum as well as MoMA, but he had a great interest in American folk art and the philosophy of John Dewey. So he was someone who really wanted to promise a broader and more socially acceptable base for American art through this project. He really set out to lay a foundation for his view of art as a form of folk expression. So his philosophy on running the FAP was really rational and founded upon this really sympathetic insight into the needs of the American art scene. So he really recognized the importance of an integration between fine art and what we would consider to be practical arts. And a lot of scholars have argued that the FAP and the philosophy of John Dewey and the all of these things that were enacted by Holder Cahill really helped to establish a middle-brow culture for art within the United States. He has some really funny quotes that I love, where he kind of slams American industrialism and the fact that all of the products, he thought all the products that were being produced through our industry were ugly in his view. But he claimed that American industrialism had produced, quote, a fearful clutter of unlovely things, and this in turn has resulted in the degradation of popular taste, since these objects provide the only art that many individuals know, end quote. So as I said, he was a big fan of John Dewey and John Dewey's philosophies. So John Dewey really considered art to be something that you experienced through participation. He argued for a continuity of aesthetics with the rest of life and culture. And he also argues against the separation between fine and practical arts. So he really wanted to integrate all of the arts together. He saw the function of art as organizing experiences more meaningfully, coherently, and vividly. And there was really an optimism to his theory, which Holder Cahill definitely subscribed to and drew upon as he was arguing for all of the things that he wanted to enact while he was running the Federal Art Project. So Holder Cahill has this great quote where he said, "It has been the function of our time to organize great democratic cultural programs for restoring the former healthy relation between artist and public. The shock needed to set these programs going was the Great Depression, which made it clear that unless the organized community stepped in, the arts would enter a dark age from which they might not recover for generations," end quote. So in the 1930s, because of the Great Depression, the art market had all but disappeared. Holder Cahill knew that this was something that he needed to really promote and work on. And rather than looking to just specific famous artists to work within his program, he really wanted to hire a lot of artists. So the organization of this project, was preceded on the principle that it is not a solitary genius, but a sound general movement which maintains art. So he's not looking for rare geniuses when he's putting together individuals to participate in the Federal Art Project. He wants to hire a ton of artists, and he hopes that because of the breadth and the depth of the art that's being created, there will be a lot for people to take in, a lot of things that will become significant over time. And it was also just meant to include as many people as possible. So he saw art as something that builds community. He saw it as something that's important to every American, and he really wanted to spread that message around through the Federal Art Project. So this is really democratic, and this is a new way to look at art that we haven't necessarily seen in the United States before. And the fact that this was a federally run program that was very democratic in spirit in the 1930s is really fascinating and inspiring. Hopefully something we can really think about and ponder as we're, suffering through this pandemic and looking at all of the issues that are going to come out of this. But let's hope that we can continue to bolster and support art and artists through this. So the Federal Art Project was divided into 4 different categories. We have the fine arts, which included murals, sculpture, easel painting, and some graphic arts. We also had the section that was dedicated to the practical arts. So what fell underneath practical arts were posters, photography, the Index of American Design, which I'll explain in a little bit, arts and crafts, dioramas, and stage sets. The Federal Art Project also included a division that focused on educational services. So this was creating gallery spaces, community art centers, art classes and teaching art, as well as research and information. And traveling art exhibitions also kind of fell under the umbrella of educational services. And then the last chunk was focused on technical and coordinating personnel. So the individuals who worked in administration to really keep all of these things up and running, because there was quite a bit that went into this federal art project. So again, the federal art project is really meant to employ out-of-work artists and to provide art. A lot of it was art for non-federal municipal buildings and public spaces. Artists, as I mentioned earlier, they were paid quite well for their time and experience and expertise. The base pay was about $23.60 a week, which might not sound like a lot to us, but in the 1930s for an out-of-work artist, it was a significant amount of money. And I've got some images here of some community art centers. So there's an image on the left of Eleanor Roosevelt at the dedication of an art center in the south side of Chicago. And then on the right, you can see the Oklahoma Art Center in Oklahoma City. So these are examples of some of the community art spaces that were created during this time. I think I mentioned there's over 100 that were created during this era. And many of them still exist today. Okay, so I had mentioned that a lot of art research was done at this time. In addition to what the FSA photographers did to kind of create an archive of images that represented the rural and impoverished areas of America, we also had an index of American design, which was so fascinating. This is a mammoth and comprehensive study on American material culture. And what this really did was it produced a pictorial survey of the crafts and decorative arts of the United States, starting with the early colonial period and running to just about 1900. So artists who worked for the index, they produced nearly 18,000 oftentimes meticulously faithful drawings that often featured watercolor. So an artist would be given an object of material culture and they would make a copy of it. It would go into the index, into that archive. And of course, because these were artisan pieces, the documentation of the work, these artists were largely anonymous who created the work, and then the artists who copied them for the index, those are more well cataloged. But objects that were copied and placed in the index range from furniture to glass to silver, stoneware, textiles. There's a little bit of everything, but there were a lot of artists employed to help with this. And Holger Cahill, the director of the FAP, saw the index as a kind of archaeology project. And he said, quote, "It helps to correct a bias which has tended to relegate the work of the craftsman and the folk artist to the subconscious of our history, where it can be recovered only by digging. In the past, we have lost whole sequences out of their story and have all but forgotten the unique contribution of hand skills in our culture," end quote. So on the screen here, I have a poster that was created for an exhibition of the Index of American Design. And then on the right, you can see an artist who has a textile in front of him and he's drawing a sketch of that piece. So you can kind of see how the documentation worked from these images. So the Library of Congress has amazing archives, and you can find over like 3,000 posters from the various New Deal art programs. So I pulled some for us that are specific to Philadelphia, so you can see some of these. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the art production and some of the fine art that was created as a result of the Federal Art Project. So the FAP commissioned a significant body of public art, often without restriction to content or subject matter, and over 10,000 artists were sustained during this time because of the Federal Art Project. They employed artists with a wide range of experiences and styles. They actually sponsored a more varied and experimental body of art, so artists didn't have to create something that was representational. They were allowed to create things that were non-representational. Abstraction still wasn't really popular within the United States, but you can actually see some work that is more abstract in design as we move through some of these pieces. And you can really start to see some of the influence that these 1930s styles, whether it's graphic art or non-representational art, had on future American movements. A lot of different artists got their start during this time period, and I'll get into some that are featured in PAFA's collection in a little bit as well. So these artists were employed from relief roles, and then a small number of non-relief artists were in supervisory positions. Artists would oftentimes be allowed to create work at home. So easel painters, sculptors, graphic artists worked at home, but of course muralists had to go out in the field to work on special projects. One of the things that was really interesting is because the Federal Art Project was a branch of the Works Progress Administration, it was structured in a very specific way. So the WPA bureaucracy often had issues in trying to balance the whims and irregular schedules of the creative process, because they were very used to the rigid timekeeping of working with employees who were building roads or bridges or infrastructure. So this was a bit of a challenge for them. At points into the WPA around 1939, there started to be budget cuts. So that was something that was difficult for everyone to deal with. And artists actually rose up at that point and started some of the first artist unions in the country. So the first one was from 1937. So this is also where we see artists participating in labor unions. So this project employed more than 5,000 artists at its peak in about 1936, and doubled that over the 8 years that it was in existence. 2,566 murals were created, over 100,000 easel paintings were created, over 17,000 sculptures, 300,000 fine arts prints. And the total investment of this program was $35 million, which is a very, very significant amount for the 30s. So this is by no means an exhaustive list of artists in PAFA's collection that benefited from the Federal Art Project, but I've pulled a few here. If you look at these names, you can see a lot of these artists became known for abstraction, but they got their start working in the 1930s in more representational or non-representational styles. You can also see that there's quite a few African-American artists listed here. And as I said, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's just a sampling of some of the artists that we have in our collection that you can find benefiting from Federal Art Project grants and money. So I wanted to take a moment to look a little bit more specifically into a few of the artists that benefited from this project. So I've got this image up here of Dox Thrash, who is a Philadelphia and PAFA favorite. So Dox Thrash was actually the Philadelphia branch of the FAP's graphic art division supervisor. Nice long title there. So as an artist, he achieved his greatest fame working with the FAP in Philadelphia's fine print workshop from 1936 to 1939. He invented a new type of printing, a mezzotint process using carborundum, an abrasive that was used in making lithographic prints to produce a range of deep, rich tones, which you can see here. He would make this his primary medium for many years, and he has, of course, become known as someone whose works are celebrated because they document changing African-American identities in the 1930s and 40s, while also addressing issues of race, history, and gender. So this piece here is from PAFA's collection. This is a rare double-sided print that he made during his tenure working at the Philadelphia FAP. And these dual images that you see here, on the left we have a dignified portrait of an African-American man called Second Thought, and on the other side we see a scene of the Philadelphia waterfront with a worker, a railroad, and the skyline. This is called East Side. So this really shows and represents the two major focuses of Thrash's work, portraiture on the left and the urban and industrial landscape on the right. Stop for a second to take a sip of water. Another local Philadelphia favorite artist who I've always loved and done research on myself is Stuart Davis. So Stuart Davis's Swing Landscape, which you can see on the left, is from 1938. And this was a mural project that was originally slated to be housed in a Williamsburg housing project in Brooklyn, New York. It was actually rejected from the site and instead came to Indiana University in 1942. And this shows a Massachusetts waterfront. You can see there's very vivid hues here. There's a rhythmic patterning to what he's doing. We're seeing floating abstract shapes. But this has become one of his most important works. We really see, some of the innovations that he made as an artist. You see a synthesis of color and form. He's playing with space and flatness, as well as realism and abstraction. So there's a lot of juxtapositions here that are really fascinating to look at. And you can see, you can kind of look at this and compare this to some of the works we've seen prior that were created by artists through New Deal art programs. But you can see this is clearly non-representational. He's playing with abstraction. So we often will think about 1930s government-funded art programs as something that's meant to be very representational. There's a propaganda element to it, but here he was really allowed to play with form, with color, and you can really see his interest in kind of creating a rhythmic tempo in his work. He was really inspired by jazz music, and so you can almost get a sense of that as you're looking at this piece. And I have an image on the right from our collection at PAFA, where you can kind of see some of the same uses of line and color and form being played out here. This has always been one of my favorite pieces. It's a print that we have in PAFA's collection, which is really gorgeous. I love the colors in this piece. Okay, and then I am going to end with a discussion about Berenice Abbott. She's one of my favorite photographers, and she is a fascinating study on someone who really was super autonomous throughout her process of creating art that was funded through the Federal Art Project. So Berenice Abbott is a documentary photographer who became super well known, who has become more well known over time, but who her main project that she's known for is an archive that she created called Changing New York, which was a book as well as a traveling exhibition. And this was work that was funded through the Federal Art Project. So she's a straight style documentary photographer. She spent the 1920s in Paris, and right as the stock market crashed, she decided she wanted to come back to the States. She came to New York with the intention of photographing the changing New York landscape. So she was really seeing the 18th and 19th century influences of New York City quickly disappearing as skyscrapers were popping up left and right. So she felt a sense of urgency to capture the city in this moment. And so she, upon returning to New York City in 1929, she knew that this was something that she wanted to photograph. So she set herself a super ambitious task. She wanted to capture this fleeting landscape during the height of the Depression and the economic devastation that occurred. This task, of course, was made more difficult by the fact that she was a woman operating in a male-dominated art scene. She was working in a medium that was still struggling to garner respect as a high art. So you can see these are photographs. And, but nonetheless, she committed to this seemingly impossible charge of recording modern life through architectural scenes rather than portraiture. So she really had the odds stacked against her in terms of what she set out to do, what medium she was working in. her gender, but she really persisted to create this giant archive of work. So she created more than 300 images of the city. The final product, as I said, was a book that was published in 1939. It contained 97 photographs chosen that she had taken between 1935 and 1938. It had text that was written by the critic Elizabeth McCausland, who was also Abbott's partner, and the text was very brief, historical, kind of didactic in nature. So the photographs were really meant to shine through. But she really set out to photograph all of New York. So she would photograph skyscrapers, she would, travel around Wall Street. She went to underdeveloped spaces in Washington Heights. She even ventured to a lot of the boroughs, but she really wanted to explore both low and high vantage points. She was really intrigued by pieces of architecture. There's close shots, far back shots. There's shots of people kind of being dwarfed by the landscape surrounding them. So there's quite a vast array of images, and I pulled 3 that kind of show some of these differences in what she was looking at. So you can see that she photographed individuals, as I said, that are kind of dwarfed by their urban landscape. She's showing the workers whose jobs are starting to disappear due to the devastation of the economic depression. And then you can see her photographs that are really capturing kind of the reverence and, I don't know, the spirituality of the city and of these giant buildings that are dwarfing everything around them. And she photographs from this low vantage point so that you can really get a sense of the height and the grandness of this imagery. So I want to talk a little bit about how she received her FAP funding. She was super independent. She wanted to work alone. And so when she came into New York City in 1929, she spent every Wednesday exploring the city with her camera for 6 years, searching for things to photograph. She worked odd jobs while doing this, searched for funding. She continued this routine, as I said, for 6 years. And in 1935, she obtained funding for her project from the FAP. And when she set out to get funding, she really branded herself and advertised herself as an outsider. She advertised herself as someone who grew up in the Midwest, who was trained as an artist in Paris, so someone who was looking at New York City from an outsider's perspective. But she wanted the FAP to fund her work, and she stressed the importance of photographing New York at this moment. So she really stressed the immediacy of it. So in her application for her FAP money, she wrote, "It is important that they should be photographed today, not tomorrow. For tomorrow may see many of these exciting and important mementos of 18th and 19th century New York swept away to make room for new colossi. The tempo of the metropolis is not of eternity or even time, but of a vanishing instant." So her urgency about capturing New York in this unique state of flux provided her with a really high degree of autonomy, not given to a lot of artists who were working on federally funded art projects at this time. So something that she was allowed to do was, when she received her funding, the FAP offered her a team. So she would operate as the photographer, but they offered her her assistants. She turned it all down. They offered her 2 researchers, money to hire a support team, money to hire a driver, assistants, researchers, but she decided to take on these jobs independently. So not only was she the photographer, but she was her own director, consultant, and printer. She traveled New York City for 3 years, completely by herself, working and funded 100% by the FAP, which is still just fascinating to me. The other thing that's really cool about her is, as I've said, she had a lot of autonomy that other artists weren't given. So if you look at someone like Dorothea Lange, the FSA photographer who was working throughout rural America, photographing individuals, Dorothea Lange was not allowed the amount of freedom that Berenice Abbott was. She didn't have control of her own images. She had to answer to higher ups, whereas Berenice Abbott really fought throughout her involvement with the FAP to control everything about her project, and she was successful in that. So as I said, she had funding for 3 years to do what she wanted. There wasn't a lot of parameters or restrictions placed on her. In the end, she created a book. There was a traveling exhibition, and this is the work of hers that's really, as I said, kind of stood the test of time, and you can still see these fascinating images. I highly recommend, if anyone wants to flip through her book, you can really get a sense of the work when looking through her book, because she didn't necessarily like for her images to just be looked at or examined on their own. She really wanted you to look at the whole archive to really get a sense of her project, the scope and depth of it. So she's a really fascinating example of just how much autonomy you could have working with the FAP. So to conclude, I wanted to talk about some of the lasting effects of the Federal Art Project and some of these New Deal art programs. So something that really sticks with us today is the fact that these projects were able to establish a national art consciousness through the experimentation that was put in place by individuals like Holdra Cahill, excuse me. It really worked to counter the Industrial Revolution, helped to restore a sensitivity that was required in order to repair breaches between artists and society. So artists were really kind of, welcomed in and seen as part of the community and an important part of society as a result of the Federal Art Project. Another important aspect of all of this work is that it really decentralized the art forces away from major metropolitan areas through the community art centers, through traveling art exhibitions, by putting practicing artists working on projects in clear view of the community. So people could actually, throughout America, they could see artists working, they could see the value that they're bringing to the community, and that had lasting effects. The last thing that really is important from this era is that this is where we really see an interest in beginning to subsidize American artists. So before this, artists were not funded by the government. This project just blew that out of the water, and now we've continued over the last almost 90 years to fund artists. And it's important that we continue to do so. So I know, taking a look at the Depression and looking at these art projects that were happening during that time, it might seem like a dire endeavor, but I really hope that this was optimistic. And you can see we've done it before. We've successfully funded the arts and made space for artists in our society and our community. And I encourage all of you to continue to look into local, state, and national levels for ways that we can fund the arts, because personally, when I think about what I go to in times of crisis, and when I'm talking with friends about what brings them joy, what brings them hope, what's kind of really creating lasting meaning for them during this struggle, they point to arts. They point to a novel that they're reading, they point to a documentary that they watched or a series on Netflix. So really think about just how important the arts are, not only in our everyday life, but as something that we turn to in times of crisis. So I'm going to conclude there, and I'm more than happy to take any questions or hear any comments from anyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristina. That was wonderful. We've already have a very active chat. Thank you all for the resources you're sharing. It's so nice to see colleagues from other institutions sharing things that they have as well that are connected to the talk. Just to go over it again, we'd love to hear from you. We can call on people if you virtually raise your hand. So if you click on the participant button at the bottom of your screen, on the right-hand side, it'll pop up and say raise hand. If we see hands, we'll call on you, or feel free to put questions in the chat. And thanks for that link, Anna. Thanks for the lovely feedback.
I'm just scrolling through the chat too to see if there's any questions that I can answer from that.
Yeah, I'm very curious too about our friends from the library, if anybody is still on the call and wanted to share some of the information they were talking about with their collection of posters. Somebody asked what the, Rosanna asked if what were the shortfalls for the FAP?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the challenging things about planning a lecture while in quarantine is I don't have access to PAFA's library of wonderful books. So a lot of my research had to be done online, and I was looking for some criticisms of the FAP and was struggling to find some that have been written about. But personally, when I was looking through the Index of American Design, the material culture that they were looking at was largely, you know, work created by white settlers, right? So the focus of the index wasn't on cataloging Native American art. So that's definitely an area where we can see, you know, a bit of an issue in what was being put together by the FAP. But that is a great question. That's something I would love to look into myself when I can get into a library and find the resources.
We had another question from the same person asking about the application process for artists. Like what components did it take? And I'm wondering, especially maybe with your in-depth knowledge of Berenice Abbott, if you knew about her or other artists, like what that was like.
Yeah, so I think it depended on what you were applying for. So Berenice Abbott, her project fell underneath the practical arts because photography was considered a practical art rather than a fine art at that time. And so I know that her application did look a little bit different than what a muralist would see. But I think that basically the applications were asking artists to kind of just make an argument for why they needed the funding and what kind of, how their work would kind of either, you know, embellish a public space or what significance it would have in the long term if it was work that was being created for an index or to contribute to an archive. So I think it definitely varied quite a bit. Something else I didn't really break down is, as you know, Holger Cahill was the overall director of the FAP, but there were subdivisions throughout the country that were run by different individuals, and they all were allowed a certain amount of autonomy to run their division as they saw fit. So it definitely varied throughout the country. Yeah. I see a question about were the post office murals part of the FAP? Yeah, so there were quite a few post office murals that were created at this time. There's some research that can be done or digged into in the Archives of American Art. So there's listings there. You can actually just start to Google. If you look into like Pennsylvania FAP projects, you can often find some of the listings of different murals that you would be able to find in your region.
Yeah, we also had another question that was really far back in the chat, and someone else brought it back up again about the link between Barnes and Cahill. I'm not sure if that was in your research. I know that this is such an expansive project, but
yeah. So I don't know specifically if Dr. Barnes and Holger Cahill were in contact. But of course, I'm sure many of you as Philadelphians know that Dr. Barnes was good friends with John Dewey and very inspired by his philosophies. So I'm sure they knew of each other, but I don't know exactly how much contact those two individuals had.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Feel free to, we'd love to hear if anyone wants to, we've had so many lovely resources shared by people. If anybody wants to raise their hand and share or ask a question that way too, it's always nice to hear your voice. Just in these last few minutes, because we do just have a couple before we have to sign off. Mm-hmm. Thanks for the lovely feedback, everybody. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if there was anything that you found that was surprising, Kristina, in your research, or like, as you kind of went in depth, looking at it with this contemporary gaze, if there were things that you found particularly surprising or things you didn't expect.
So I first really dug into the Federal Art Project and New Deal art programs when I was writing my master's thesis, and Berenice Abbott was a chapter of that. So I was really looking at it through this, as they called it, practical art lens. I didn't know that much about the philosophy behind the origins of the Federal Art Project. So that was kind of my favorite thing to really look into and research, was to see the links between John Dewey and this idea of art as experience and art as community building, and how that influenced the overall philosophy of a lot of these projects. As an art educator, art historian, myself, I'm always really, really happy to see anyone who's looking at art as community building and really infiltrating that into the work that they do. That's always something that makes me very happy. Yeah.
Thanks. And we have a hand from another one of our colleagues, Susanna. I'm going to unmute you.
We got an unmuting competition. Thanks, Kristina, for a really fantastic talk. It was super interesting. My head's going in a bunch of different directions, so sorry if I ask you a few and you can like pick what you want to answer. So as an educator and an art historian, how have you found ways to sort of incorporate your research into some of the public programming that you do? And are there any ways that, like, so you're talking about you work, you can get into the library. Are any of these archives digitized anywhere? Are there ways to access some of this stuff from home?
So it was a little challenging to access information. The Library of Congress definitely has archival material about some of these art programs. I found some really great articles on JSTOR that I was able to access, so I had some scholarly resources. But as someone who is both an art educator and an art historian, and my background is also in English education, I used to be a high school English teacher, and this is sort of a second career for me. My brain always automatically goes towards how something can be educational or made accessible to the masses. So that's just kind of my own research interest, and I can't really let go of it. So that kind of steers what I do. So once I kind of started to learn about how John Dewey's philosophy really infiltrated all of this work, that was something that I really would cling to and try to figure out exactly how that really played out throughout all of these different projects. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
I think we have time for one more question, and maybe one or two, but there's one in the chat saying, what can we implement today based on this model? And so more just to hear your opinion on it, because I know that it could be a difficult one to tackle, but it seems like a nice way to kind of wrap up to today's talk, bringing it back to our present moment.
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question, how we can implement some of this for today. So one of the things that I think we often look to in 2020 is a quick fix. What I really liked about a lot of these New Deal art programs is they were looking to not only, add or institute art, like art as community building, or add murals or works of art that you would see in person and in public, but there was really a focus on looking to future generations. So building art community centers is something that would last. Building a mural is something that would last. So I think that that's something that's really inspiring as we're looking to fund arts in this time of crisis, or just fund arts in the 21st century. I think it's important to really look at what would make a lasting impact for our communities and keeping that in mind. But also I really love that the Federal Art Project and a lot of these art programs didn't necessarily look at the artist as an artist, but as a contributing member of society who had something to offer during a time of struggle. So, you know, artists were treated the same as someone who was working within the infrastructure system and building roads. So just putting artists and the contributions that they have on equal level to other laborers is something that I think we can really look at and think about today, in addition to, you know, all of the great work in community building that the arts do.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Kristina, for being here. And thank you to all of you for being such a lovely audience. It was so nice to see so many returning faces and a few new. We hope to see you again at another PAFA Zoom event. Thanks, Anna, for the applause. Feel free to unmute yourself and say goodbye on your way out, but take care, everybody, and we hope to see you again. We have programs later this week. We'll have some more next week as well that will be on the site soon. So take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much,
Thank
Kristina.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Take care.